Okay, so welcome everyone. We have Lilybell Sweet presenting today for the Journal Club. And so, yeah, before I go into the title, Lilybell is a PhD student at the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research in Leipzig. And she also collaborates, or she used to, I don't know I think she still collaborates with folks at NASA, GIS on the ATOMIC project. And so she's been to New York. Hopefully we can, have her visit here again. And so today she'll talk to us about her recent work that appeared in what's the acronym for the journal?
AIES, I think.
AIES. This is this new AI journal from AMS. So the floor is yours.
Hi. So basically, cross-validation strategy impacts the interpretation and performance of machine learning models. And my first PhD paper, so very exciting. And it's been online for a little while now, but literally like yesterday, I think the official typeset version is now online. So I'm feeling very, very like a real scientist now. It's very nice. I've been collaborating with Christoph Müller, Mohit, and Jakob, my supervisor. I'm in Leipzig, like you said, where I work in the Compound Weather and Climate Events group, led by Jakob. That's us on our retreat, which was yesterday on a boat in Sächsische Schweiz. And we have about half the group does kind of machine learning approaches, the other half more statistical. We are basically interested in compounding climate extremes and their impacts, or how they will be impacted by climate change. But also, on a similar note, the idea that extreme impacts can arise from compounding less extreme climate drivers. So we work on different kinds of impacts like floods, crop failures, wildfires, forest mortality events, all kinds of different stuff. Yeah. So the motivation for this work, I should say I'm the crop yield failure event person in the group. That's my disaster of choice. And the motivation for my PhD and the overall project was that basically the future projections of global agricultural yields are really uncertain. And this paper by Jonas in Columbia at NASA showed that most of that uncertainty was actually from variation between the crop models. Obviously a portion also from the climate models, but for these future projections, a lot of it is actually from the crop models, which is not really surprising because we also know that the current crop models that are in use, the process-based crop models, underestimate the impacts of extreme climate events like droughts and heat waves. Sometimes they capture it reasonably well, but they always do kind of underestimate. And no one's really surprised by this because there's a lot of processes that just aren't in the models. A lot of pests and diseases, for example, flooding events maybe are not so much well captured, frost events, I think also. But also, again, I work in the compound events group, and a big kind of push forward, it seems, in the last years has been showing with kind of quite simple models that you can get really extreme impacts, not just from extreme climate events, but also from the compounding effects of more moderate climate events. One example for this in crops is this false spring phenomenon, where you can get a huge crop failure if you get a warmer winter, enough that the crop enters a vulnerable phenological stage too early. And then there's this frost, which kills it all off too early, basically. And this can be really devastating. This led to this huge vineyard failures in France. There's things you can do. You can light fires in the fields to try and warm them up, but it can be really devastating. And these events by themselves are not so extreme, but the compounding effect of them is what's really the problem. But this is really hard to study. And it's really hard to study with crops too, because there's so much interaction from genetics and management. So the idea really with how to proceed with that is that we know machine learning models are really good at capturing these kind of super complex interacting relationships. And there's been a lot of success recently in using machine learning to predict crop yields from climate and other drivers. But of course, black box, blah, blah, blah. How do we then actually learn about these relationships? And it really, there's this kind of, this idea, which was the motivation for my PhD project. Can we use these explainable methods to get these relationships out? And there's been a few papers trying to do this. This one was from Gunnar Lischeid et al. From last year, where they used a few different machine learning models. I think they had a random forest and an SVM. I think maybe one other or maybe not. And they try to predict German yields from climate. And then they use partial dependence plot to try and extract these relationships after. And you see that you're able to get these nice nonlinear relationships. But unfortunately, they weren't really happy. Actually, the paper is called Machine Learning, something like No Replacement for Science, because they found their results to be pretty ambiguous. They found that models with very, very different sets of features would give very similar predictive performance, which is no surprise if you work with machine learning. But also the interpretations they got out were also very different. And then in other papers doing similar things, for example, this other one, which is also in the same journal that I went for, where they were using LSTM to predict the US maize yields and got very high predictive performance. They also found that when they tried to use some interpretation methods, wind direction was identified as the most important feature. But then removing wind direction from the input didn't reduce the prediction accuracy, which is a bit confusing. I would say that seems like something is a bit wrong there. But the thing is, when you put loads of features in that you think might be causal, it's very easy to justify whatever interpretation you get out. It's not so easy to falsify this. At the same time, there's been a lot of papers recently discussing how people are evaluating these machine learning global maps that are made, for example, of soils and so on, and discussing better ways of validating model performance. And again, this is super, super not surprising for machine learning, because machine learning assumes IID samples.
Sorry, hold on. Could folks mute themselves, please? We're getting some. I think it's
I think you might be able to mute them if you're the organizer.
Okay, should I mute?
Yeah. Right next to more.
Oh, sorry, what? Oh, okay. Okay, cool. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Sorry about, yeah.
No worries. So yeah, I mean, a lot of machine learning assumes IID, which is obviously not the case when you have spatiotemporal climate data with all this spatial and temporal autocorrelation. So I was wondering if this might have something to do with some of these ambiguous results, or if the way, because a lot of these interpretation methods, you have to select your test set that you want to apply them on. I wondered what implication this had for interpretation methods. And this seemed like a really obvious question, or something that there had obviously must be known or had been found before. But after quite a lot of reading, I didn't manage to find some clear results on this. So I decided to just test it myself on my data to see what happened, basically, which is what I did. So then this ended up becoming a study in its own right, because it was kind of interesting. And the questions for this were then, does the cross-validation, the evaluation strategy, have an impact on the interpretation you get? And is there a way that we can find out what the most plausible explanations are and which strategy gives us those? So the idea is very simple. A lot of similar papers that I read, basically they take all the growing season climate indices and they try to predict the yield anomaly. This is then a machine learning model. So it's usually a random forest for agricultural studies. That's definitely the most popular, but LSTMs have also been used. And then they chuck on a post hoc interpretation method, feature importances, Shapley values, partial dependence plots, etc. All have been used. Feature importance is the most common because they're the most simple. And then what I do is first I want to do a sanity check and show that the evaluation needs to consider the spatial and temporal autocorrelation, because a lot of studies doing this just use random k-fold, for example, which ignores this correlation. But then more interestingly, because I get this climate indices and yield anomaly from a crop model. So I take the input and output of a process-based model. So I'm basically trying to then emulate this model, and then that allows us to comment on whether the interpretations we get out are really plausible based on our knowledge of how the model works. So there's a lot of information here, too much information, but basically I kind of run two different experiments. So one where I kept the model the same. I use random forest because it's the most commonly used for this type of study. And I don't change any hyperparameters. I don't do any feature selection. I use a standard set of climate indices. And the only thing that I vary is the cross-validation method for the interpretation and the evaluation. And then in a second experiment, I also use nested cross-validation of the same type to tune hyperparameters and to select features and so on. So this can then affect the generalization performance on held out years and regions. But yeah, very complicated. We moved to the results basically. And also I should explain the cross-validation methods that I tested. So random k-fold, just take a random sample of all my data points. My data points are in space and in time. I use global data at a 0.5 degree resolution, and it's model data, so I have a whole load of it, but it's driven by reanalysis for 60 years, so quite a lot of data points. And I pull them all together in space and time. I ignore that, and so in random k-fold, I could just take a completely random sample of this. And then I do temporal cross-validation, which is again commonly used. I try some spatial methods and some spatiotemporal methods. But the more interesting one is this idea of feature space clusters, where I take all my input, all my data points, and I cluster them very simply using k-means in the feature space, so in the climate space, in my 37-dimensional feature input set of features. I cluster in this. So the idea would be that, for example, one cluster might be particularly hot or particularly dry. It could be anywhere in space and time. So the model would never have encountered points that are that hot or that dry. So it kind of forces the model into an extrapolation regime. This is kind of what these clusters might look like. So this is just 2 out of my 37 features. And it's colored by the cluster here, so you can see that they're in this feature space. So first of all, the sanity check, like I said, looking at the performance scores. So this is, again, the model is kept the same. I'm just trying to predict yield anomaly from 37 growing season climate indices. And when I measure performance using random k-fold, I get above 0.8. which is pretty good, pretty good. Unfortunately, when I then evaluate the model's skill on unseen years or unseen regions, that plummets. On unseen regions and years, that goes to now 0.4. And then when I use a different kind of cross-validation strategy, this is more close, but you get a lot more variation. So this is not particularly exciting. There's been studies like this before. This comes from the autocorrelation in the spatiotemporal data that is ignored. The model overfits. The model is able to cheat. The model learns some shortcuts, some spurious correlations that it then can't exploit when you take it into a new regime.
Lilibelle, I have a question.
Yeah.
You say model here, is this, I'm assuming this is a statistical model and not the process-based model, right?
No, so basically what I'm doing is the data that I'm trying to predict is from a process-based model. So it's kind of a perfect model experiment. There's no observational data here. So in theory, the model is completely driven by this climate data. There aren't any other effects that I'm ignoring, really. So it should be possible to get really, really good performance, theoretically. And the model I then train to emulate that model is a random forest.
Okay, good. So you're comparing a random forest statistical model on just model outputs and
exactly, yeah. Yeah. The thing is, the thing is that if I did this with observational data, I wouldn't be able to have I wouldn't be able to comment on the interpretations, whether they're, plausible or not, because there's just too much complication there. That was the motivation between using this model data. Yeah. So maybe I'd move on to the interpretations, where I looked at the feature importances, which is the permutation feature importances, which is the most common possible and most simple, I think, way to interpret a model. And a bit complicated graphs here, but as you see along the left here, you see the different types of cross-validation that I used. Along the right are the different climate indices that I used. So I use monthly temperature averages, radiation averages, and precipitation averages for 3 months before sowing, and then 7 months after sowing. And then on the bottom right, some hand-picked extreme indicators like the number of warm days, cool days, frost days, maximum temperature in the growing season, minimum temperature in the growing season. Yeah, these are quite standard ones taken from literature. And the darker the shade here, the more important that feature is. And the size of these white circles reflects the variation between the folds. Because I do 20-fold cross-validation, I get a different feature importance score in each of those 20 folds. So these can vary or not, and that's what the white circles represent. And the obvious thing is that they do agree on a lot of things. No matter what cross-validation method you use, we see that precipitation for 2 and 3 months after sowing is really important, and also the number of warm days during the growing season is really important, which makes a lot of sense for trying to predict maize yield. Like, that makes a lot of sense. But unfortunately, we also see some differences, and I think this one is the one we were least happy with, which is the radiation 3 months before sowing, which is actually, if I use random k-fold to calculate this is the most important radiation feature of all, more important than radiation 3 months after sowing, when photosynthesis is actually occurring, which doesn't seem right. And it's a huge difference. And here's another way of looking at this, where the ranked features are on both axes. Using random k-fold is the y, and using this feature clusters method is on the x. And the lower is the most important. And if they agree, they should lie on this blue line. And you see they do agree that frost days is not important at all. And they do agree that warm days is super important in the bottom left-hand side, and also the precipitation 2 or 3 months after growing. But you can see that really, really far away from all the other points is this radiation point here, where radiation 3 months before sowing is really, really important using random k-fold, and super unimportant using feature clusters. Now, this is a really, really big difference. And this kind of worries me a bit, because if you do this type of study, and these studies are done a lot, and you fit a model and you use random k-fold to estimate your performance, or a random test set, you get an R-squared score of like above 0.8, and then you take your feature importances and you get these. Some of them are very, very plausible, and there's very little variation between the folds. These white circles are very tiny. You think these are really, really confident. But this score for radiation really goes against how the model actually works, which is LPJmL. It really doesn't make sense at all. This is some kind of spurious correlation that is being learned, that the model is using to cheat, basically. That's what we think. And another reason we think this is because when I then do the second experiment, where I then use nested cross-validation to tune and to select features, the only case for which the performance actually increases on the unseen years and region after tuning is when I tune using feature space clusters again. For all others, the performance stays the same or actually decreases the model generalization performance, which is another reason why I think that the features selected and the importances you get using this kind of feature cluster extrapolation space are more likely to be the closer to the causal drivers. But we were really confused why this is. We thought maybe there was feature collinearity. When you calculate permutation importance, you see that you can, if you have a highly correlated feature and you permute one, you can get something that's super, super unrealistic. And this has been, this has been pointed out by many people as maybe a reason for this kind of dodgy behavior. And so when I looked at my data, as you see, this is just two of the features, and there is this correlation, right? And on the left, you see the raw data, and on the right, you see the artificial points that are created when you permute. When you calculate permutation feature importance, you permute one feature. And you can see the correlation disappears, and a lot of these data points are probably completely unrealistic. On the other hand, when you use feature clusters, so you are only permuting over a much narrower space, the correlations are much, much more preserved. So the artificial data points that you're using to interpret your model are much more realistic. This made us get really excited. And then you can see this kind of holds everywhere. So the middle is the correlation between the original data points. On the left is the correlation between the artificial data points when you use this, when you just, use it, do it randomly, do it over the entire distribution. And on the right is when you permute using this feature space clusters. So inside each cluster individually you permute, and it's not perfect, but it preserves a lot of the multivariate correlation. And we got really excited, but it turns out that's not why. That's not why that's not why the effect is happening at all. Because then we tried to use these more realistic permuted data points, but still, train and test using random k-fold, using random test sets. And actually the feature importances didn't change at all. So it would have been cool if that was it, but it's not. So then why is it? My theory is that it's because when you do this, so say you're testing on this green fold, the model has never seen any points in the climate like this, and it's forced to extrapolate. So the model can learn a whole load of different rules, a whole mess of them, and only some of them will then apply into different test sets, for example. And I think the idea is that if they still apply in the extrapolation setting, they're more likely to be causal. So although you learn a whole load of different relationships when you train on the entire distribution, only a few of them will then carry forward into the extrapolation. So you have a chance of kind of stripping away some of these shortcuts. But this is really just a hypothesis. Another thing I quickly want to say is that about the circles and the variation between folds, a lot of the time, this variation in feature importance is seen as uncertainty, like an error. But while working on this, we kind of found that actually this might be more interesting than this, because the different clusters are in different climate regions. We can then find relationships between the climate characteristic of a fold and the importance in that fold. So you can then have a look at the interactions here. And what we found, for example, was that warm days gets slightly more important depending on how warm that cluster is. And so it's only when you get to about 40 warm days on average over the growing season that suddenly it doesn't get, then it can get more important, but maybe due to an interaction with another feature, for example. So we hope this could be used maybe to try to find some interacting or some preconditioning effects. So instead of being seen as uncertainty, as you might see here, it's more actually representing these complex relationships that you're trying to compress into a very, very low-dimensional space. Yeah, so that's kind of the ongoing work now, is to try to use this to find interactions between drivers, and then use this to find compounding drivers of extreme impacts. So yeah, sorry, I think I maybe overran a little bit in time, but yeah, basically these were the main conclusions from the study. It's only like one case study on one data set, so it's really difficult for me to make any general conclusions like, yes, you should always do clustering and feature space if you want to interpret the underlying process. But I'm hoping to explore, I have explored this a bit more, and I'm hoping to continue to explore this a little bit more. And yeah, I hope that was interesting. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Lilibel. By the way, you were not over time at all. So if you wanted to say more, you're welcome to. But don't no pressure. Any questions?
Yeah, you're looking at me.
I know, I'm looking at you.
First, that was great. I mean, you were super clear. That was pretty awesome the way you presented. Actually, we've been thinking a lot about those things. So I'm asking the question, but I think it's like reflecting a lot of the discussions we had in the past. Especially about spatial and temporal variability. So, for instance, AI has been looking at phenology, like year-to-year variability, and it's very difficult to capture with those models, right? Because of course, if you use machine learning and it's very straightforward, you're going to get the spatial structure, you get the seasonal structure really well, but then the anomalies, which are the interesting things, right? You're doing a terrible job actually at capturing most of that, and so it's complicated to know. And Jatan had the same issue with fires, right? Wildfires, where, if you build a model, you're just getting things that are kind of too simple, right? I mean, there's no fire when it's a desert, right? And you're getting fires, so and that's not interesting, right? You want to say that when it getting drier, you're getting more fires potentially, right? So the fuel is changing, So there's a lot of that where space and season are really the drivers, of a lot of the variability and the variance. And so I'd be curious to hear, because you talked about those clusters, but in a sense, they capture some of those spatial and seasonal variation potentially. So yeah, I'd just be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, exactly. This is really the motivation behind looking into this more. Exactly. Yeah, maybe I can comment a little bit on some of it. Let me have a think. I mean, yeah, it is basically the case that these clusters are kind of although theoretically they can come from anywhere in this huge space-time cube that I have, in actuality they tend to be a little clustered in space and in time, of course, because you do get certain regions, but they're not completely clustered in space. There just is this kind of behavior. I think the real key behind this working a little bit is the fact that the model is having to extrapolate climate-wise, so it's not able to make use of any kind of spurious correlations that might have worked in other regions. And just doing it in space and in time, on the other hand, didn't really work. I think it really needs to be that the distribution of the test set or the set that you're using for interpretation has to be kind of as far away as possible, almost, in the feature space. There's some recent paper this year from Hannah Meyer's group in Münster, where they also looked at, in parallel also, using a kind of feature space method of doing this too, and found that in comparison to doing a spatial cross-validation, doing a feature space cross-validation also led to better generalizability, better generalization performance. In terms of the interpretations, I feel like a real big issue with a lot of research that's using interpretable machine learning methods is that you put in a lot of causal drivers, and anything you get out, either you can kind of come up with a story, and you tend to pick out the things that you know to be true and say, oh, I found some interesting stuff. But when you see something that doesn't really make sense to you, I don't think these methods are really validated enough that we can really believe necessarily that this is actually some causal driver that you found. So I really hope that, there's causal discovery methods, of course, but then trying to actually get them to work on spatiotemporal or real data is really challenging. We have a couple of people in our group who work with causal discovery methods, and it's very difficult. Doesn't always work. So yeah, I'm hoping that something like this could maybe be something kind of in the middle, and maybe we can do similar studies with toy data or with simulated data, where we can kind of validate that these work and under what situations they work, so that then when we move into the observational data, we can have a little bit more trust that they are real. I'm not sure if that answers your point exactly.
Yeah, to the causal point, I think the point that you mentioned about it doesn't work in extrapolation, and a good causal model should work in extrapolation. I think, Jonas Peters started with this one point and then went and wrote like a 100-page paper, which is like,
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Actually, so I do think that this is connected to this idea that he put forward of environmental invariance for causal discovery. I actually had a really long discussion with Nicola Gnecco, who was his postdoc, but I'm not sure if he's his postdoc anymore because now he's moving to a different institute. But anyway, and yeah, we're kind of exploring the connection there. And I also had a quick chat with Jakob Runger about this too. What I think is, this could be connected. And the thing is that for environmental invariance, you assume that you have some environmental variable, which is having a causal influence on your features, on your predictors, but then not on your target. And I think in a lot of, and that seems like a big assumption, but actually I think for a lot of things this does hold. Maybe in climate, for example, here these clusters must be caused by some climatey thing going on. I don't know, but it's not. I think it could be reasonable to assume that that's not actually affecting the day-to-day crop growth in comparison. But it's a difficult assumption, and I don't think there will be a data-driven way to validate if the clusters you get out are actually caused by some environmental variable. Yeah.
This is a very good discussion.
Can I ask one more question? Sorry.
Of course.
Sorry, you had one. Go ahead. No, so in your experiment, you have a crop model, right, in the back, right? So you can poke that, right? You know the causal stuff, right? But to some extent, when we build those models, I think there's a bunch of like confounders, you could say. I don't know if that's the right word, but whatever, but there's basically spatial and temporal correlation in the input features, right? So it's a mess, you could get, and maybe you're undersampling that as well, so you're not really getting the diversity that you need. Internally, you could have like epistemic errors, right? The structure of your model is incorrect as well, right? I mean, or you're struggling to get that right. And then on the output, because you're trying to build those correlations, so you have those confounders there. Maybe the dimension or how can I say, the dimension of the observation is too small, right? So you're not really sampling your phase space the right way, right? Yeah. But I kind of feel that if you have a model in the back, you could test all of those different hypotheses. Like, is it the input? Is it internal, or is it just a? I know what you mean.
Yeah, the thing is, I thought about this as well, and also this is a topic in my group a little bit too. We actually had a bit of discussion on this in the retreat, but then the question is how to generate the forcing data to prod this, because you still want to have realistic climate data that has these drivers that identify. It's difficult to generate this kind of multivariate, realistic climate data that has these bigger features that I put. For example, one of these indices is the number of warm days. Yeah, I can increase the number of warm days, but how to increase the number of warm days in a way that kind of makes sense. And then when I run the crop model, I also need to keep they run steadily for many, many years. You don't just like run them for a year and then stop. They need spin up period and so on. So it's a little bit difficult actually to kind of do this prodding and really look at this. Which is why maybe now we move on to some toy data, some simulated data, so that we can prod it a bit easier. That's part of the plan now, I think. But yeah, the other thing is, I think one of the things with causal discovery is because now I tried to relate this a bit to causal discovery and environmental invariance, and I guess the thing there is that what I do here is a bit different somehow, because I look for relationships that you learn in the training set that still apply in the test set. So I will not get any relationships that are lost from misspecification, for example. But I should try to. It's more that I want to reduce the spurious stuff, reduce the shortcuts that are able to learn. So yeah, I think I don't see this working as in this is definitely going to give you back the causal structure, because completely these problems will emerge. But maybe this is more of a strategy to get rid of a few spurious correlations or some of the shortcuts. But it's not as rigorous as causal discovery at all.
Oh, very interesting. I'm wondering if you could maybe walk through in a little bit more detail how you use the different validation methods in the feature selection and tuning part, like that second set of experiments you did.
Yeah, sure. So basically, I take my entire big data cube test set in space and in time, and then I do 20-fold cross validation. But then, so then I have 19 now for my training set, and then inside this 19, I then do another cross validation, while I do tuning and feature selection. So I ended up doing that 20 times in these different 20 outer folds. So I end up with 20 different models because they have different feature sets and different hyperparameters, actually. And yeah, the features selected are also interesting because they barely vary at all. For K-fold, you get basically the same features being selected in every single fold. Whereas for feature clusters, you do get a lot of variation. But for example, this radiation feature, this radiation 3 months before sowing, that's never selected at all. That's never picked up, I think. Whereas of course it's picked up every single time for K-fold. So anyway, yeah, you end up with different models with different features and different, the tuning is different, so the structure of the model is different, which leads to the difference in performance when I take it to the unseen years and regions.
Yeah, so do you use all those models together to characterize, or was each of those individual points a different model?
Yeah, let me go back. So I think the only plot I showed from this was this one. And this one you can see that you get 20 different points, which is the performance from the 20 different models.
I see. Okay.
The other results I showed were from where the model was the same in all cases. It was really, yeah. This is the only one I show, I think, where after the tuning and the feature selection. The thing is that once I've done the feature selection, it's no longer easy to compare the interpretations because they all have different features in, so it's, yeah, not so easy anymore.
Also for folks online, if you have a question, please jump in.
I mean, I can also mention, because I didn't put this in the paper, but I did also do this with partial dependence plots, and I get a similar effect. The partial dependence plots using K-fold were very different to the ones I get using feature clusters. But in this case, so when you do permutation and feature importance, you compare against the real data, right? Whereas in partial dependence plots, you don't. You're just showing the model performance, how it would be. You're not comparing against, what it should be. But still, I get that the permutation is super different. I think that more comes from the thing I showed at how the generated features are more realistic. Because similarly to permutation performance, when you calculate partial dependence plots, you're obviously creating these artificial data points that could be completely unrealistic based on these correlations. And so I think when you do this, but restrict it into these feature clusters, you restrict it to more realistic points. Yeah. So I got different relationships coming from each cluster. But actually, I think you can get more information out of that. I think it's actually and more representative of the way the model works. But yeah, this isn't in the paper because it just got too long.
I mean, can I ask about the paper, like from a like how was the refereeing, etc. Like, because it's a new journal, and I wonder like how they received this paper. Given that I think this is extremely important, but like I can imagine, the community being a little like but like how.
Yeah. I've actually been so surprised because so I I mean, I started doing this because I wanted to know the answer for my own research. It wasn't like I planned for this to become a paper. I really just needed to know the answer just for myself. And, you know, it's not the most exciting topic to say. People are like, what are you working on? I'm like, cross-validation. People get a bit bored. So I know I was really, and also it seems like a very basic thing that should have been that should be done. I was really convinced there must be some huge body of work that I just hadn't found where this was already explored and already, you know, existing. And I spent a lot of time hunting through different things. And if someone does find something, please send it to me, because I still believe it could be out there. Yeah, so I really expected it to be, you know, oh great, well, this paper sounds boring. Yeah, not really interesting. But no, I had a great experience with the journal actually. The review period was super fast, and also I got 3 reviewers, and all of the comments were really on point. They really got what I was trying to do. They were really interested as well. Yeah, they had a lot of ideas. I think one of them was like, I know you can't do all of this in the paper, but it's interesting. And yeah, I had a great experience. Like really, it was super nice. And I'm actually surprised as well. When I've been to conferences or like presented this a little bit, I've had a lot of people being engaged or like wanting to talk about it more or like follow up a little bit. So I feel like, yeah, I also thought this was like a boring topic somehow. People were going to not really want to know about it. But I think actually people are starting to get really interested in model evaluation in general. And also interpretation is really taking off. So maybe somehow this is all kind of becoming more interesting.
I had a quick question, actually. Thank you for the talk. So I was just wondering if you did a similar type of analysis, but using like Shapley values and more broadly. No. Okay.
No, but I
want to comment on your thoughts of using Shapley versus like feature importance.
Yeah. So I think it would still hold basically. That's what I think, but I don't know. So I did actually, one of my colleagues used Shapley values for another experiment, and I did send him my feature clusters because it's just a tiny little code that it's like it fits with scikit-learn, you know, it's nothing. I just sent it to him and was like, just try. And he did. And actually, yeah, there was some difference in what he got out, but it was quite small. And it was also difficult to say because this was trained on observation data. It was a different field, so it was difficult to say, you know, what's right, what's wrong. I don't know, but I think that it. Yeah, I think that it was, and the model was actually really excellent, and he did test it very thoroughly in like different catchments, and it was a hydrological one. But there was a bit of a difference, and I do think the same thing would happen. And also, I have to say, since I finished the paper, I got really into adversarial robustness reading, because this is also connected. It's just that in adversarial robustness, it's not enough to say that the interpretation is affected by the data input. You have to say, I found I found an algorithm that can find the worst possible data input. So you have to put this kind of spin on it. But there is a couple of papers showing that also Shapley values are adversarially vulnerable to adversarial attacks, by which selective data choice to like kind of perturb what you get. Which I think means this would also happen. But I really want to extend, because the thing is, I have all the code for this whole experiment. It would be very easy to just plug in the Shapley values and kind of do it. But I guess I wasn't sure. The paper was already so long, just with feature importances. And now I feel like if I do it for partial dependence plots and Shapley values, that's kind of, I already did this paper. Is it novel? Is it enough? But I also feel like this information should be out there, or like these results should be published somewhere that people can see. I don't know.
Thank you.
The last. What is the reference for the adversarial robustness? Like, could you like, I don't know, email it to me or something? I could pass it on.
I can email it to you, definitely. Yeah. I really only got down this rabbit hole the last few weeks, actually, because I always was like, you know, I read a couple of adversarial robustness papers a while ago, because I wanted to have citations for machine learning isn't always perfect. But but I didn't get really into the rabbit hole. And then the last couple of weeks, I really got into it, and I really see a lot of similarities. There's another paper I read about partial dependence plots, adversarial robustness, where they actually train a genetic algorithm. They use a genetic algorithm to find the most different possible the data points that can give you the most different possible partial dependence plot, and it's kind of nice, but also I feel like I mean, for us, where we're not worried about people trying to hack into our models and or like pretend that the models are not sexist or something, it's enough to say that the interpretation is affected by the data set choice. So it's like if you think so I think there's a lot of papers probably in this adversarial robustness space that can also apply for what we do. I just personally wasn't aware that it did apply for the framing.
Since I guess there are no more questions, at least online, so I think we can wrap this up officially. But if you want to stay on, like, we can.
Yeah, I can stay on.
Yeah, let's thank.
Right in Germany, I guess.
Yes, this is.
Yeah, it's like 20 past 10, but I mean, I've got no plans now.
Be taking your life.
and that reminds me. Thank you again, Lilybelle, for like taking out the time.
No worries. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, very cool. Thanks so much.
Yep.